Your government is a fusion between the Judeo-Christian belief system and the Enlightenment. And you'll learn all about it right here. I am discussing this in the context of this word liberty. Liberty. Because liberty is connected to power. Rights are connected to power. I'm not talking about from a faith or theoretical perspective. They come from God. I'm talking about how they're to be applied here on earth. Marxism rejects God, rejects individual sovereignty, and embraces authoritarian coercion. It was actually George Mason who wrote the Virginia Bill of Rights, which preceded the Declaration of Independence by about a month, and from whom Jefferson borrowed, and he also borrowed from Locke, which is okay. He admitted later, he said, look, I wasn't here to create things out of whole cloth. I was there to put together a declaration of the colonies for the whole world to know that what we were doing of independence. It was Mason who insisted that also at the convention that we needed to have these Bill of Rights for the individual. Now, when you go through the Bill of Rights, you'll notice that who do they protect? The individual against the federal government. The individual against the federal government. By the way, a footnote that raises another issue. Well, how is it that the Bill of Rights then apply to the states? They were intended to apply to the federal government. All that. 10 amendments. The states were on their own. Because the Supreme Court eventually ruled on certain of the amendments that they were going to apply them to the states. That's how it happened. There was no superseding amendment that said all the Bill of Rights apply to the states. The Supreme Court ruled that. And it hasn't applied all of them, but it's applied most of them. When you read the Ninth Amendment, in my view, is the short reference to the Declaration of Independence, individual liberty. You know, you had activists on the Supreme Court that said the Ninth Amendment doesn't really mean anything, it's just a statement of fact. That's not correct. And then you have the 10th Amendment, which is very important, which also the activists ignore, which says, hey, look, whatever we don't put in here, it belongs in the states. We're not here to take power from the states except to the extent that we've made agreement right here in this parchment that the states have ratified it, but all the other powers belong in the states. So the action was in the states. So they tried to protect the individual, their sovereignty, and state authority. So this is how they used power. This is why they divided power. On the one hand, man is sovereign, the individual. Society, people in a society, they are sovereign. But on the other hand, you can't have mobocracy. You have certain God-given rights. That's what the Declaration says. Unalienable rights. Among them, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness means your own free will to fulfill your life. That's what it means. So on the one hand, they were well aware that the people must be sovereign. On the other hand, they were aware that men are imperfect. Some can be downright evil. Some would exploit liberty to destroy the liberty of others while they're expanding their own liberty. And they looked at the Enlightenment. And so your government is a fusion between the Judeo-Christian belief system and the Enlightenment. And you'll learn all about it right here. I am discussing this in the context of this word liberty. Liberty. Because liberty is connected to power. Rights are connected to power. I'm not talking about from a faith or theoretical perspective. They come from God. I'm talking about how they're to be applied here on earth. Marxism rejects God, rejects individual sovereignty, and embraces authoritarian coercion. Islamism rejects the Judeo-Christian belief system. It's a different religion, but it rejects the Enlightenment. Radical Islam is stuck in the 7th century. It never went through the Reformation. It never embraced the Enlightenment. And so that is faith fused with coercion. Marxism is coercion, pure and simple. And so they don't adopt the idea that power checks power. They don't adopt the idea that the people are the sovereign. They don't adopt any of that. So when you have people running for office like a Mandami, or you have people like Bernie Sanders talking about we're the people and the billionaire and going on and on, they come from a place that is absolutely incompatible with the founding of the United States. It's incompatible, which is why I wrote the book, which is why I think it's so important. Now, let me go on with the liberty issue. The common thread in all of this, from Aristotle to today, is that liberty is one of those words and one of those ideas that are best defined by, first, what they are not, and second, in the context of other words and ideas, such as rights, of course, as explained in Chapter 5. Liberty without rights is essentially meaningless. You need morality, you need virtue, you need a lot of things. Even in a mostly open and democratic society, liberty's permanence goes largely unnoticed, unless and until it is believed to be imperiled. We live still in the freest country, but we don't really think about it, do we? And I'm saying, well, you should. Even then, depending on the nature of the threat, it may be ignored, unnoticed, or tolerated. Conversely, tyranny, again, depending on its nature, seems easier to comprehend. It can be oppressive, cruel, unfair, severe, physical, psychological, and so forth, and therefore more readily seen and felt. You know, you can't really feel liberty, but if someone punches you in the nose, that you feel. But when we talk about liberty and rights, do we not repeatedly and necessarily come back to the question of power? Even when acknowledging God-given unalienable rights and universal eternal truths, is that not the power of God as opposed to the power of man and man's government? I believe this to be a crucial point. As I wrote several times earlier, power, rights, and liberty are intertwined. The issue is, when trying to understand them and unravel them for purposes of analyzing them, how should one approach it? We already did that, right, with liberty? That said, I move on to further examine how liberty was perceived by another of America's most influential founders, Alexander Hamilton. His notion about liberty and the role of government often conflicted with Jefferson's and Madison's. Indeed, it turns out that Hamilton is among the most popular, if not the most popular founder, among those who today support a more centralized and activist government, liberals, leftists. There's good reason for this, hence the popularity of Hamilton, the Broadway musical, especially with the elites in entertainment, media, and politics, and among other academicians. In examining Hamilton, I begin with Madison. Madison, who wrote in Federalist 45 that powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on the external objects, as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which the last, the power of taxation, will be, the most part, be connected. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. Well, it hasn't turned out that way, has it? But nonetheless, that was the plan. And this was the overwhelming view of those who drafted and ratified the Constitution. Again, I'm reading from On Power. Now, obviously, Hamilton fought for the Constitution's ratification. And along with Madison, and to a lesser extent John Jay, he wrote the pro-Constitution Federalist Papers. Nonetheless, it is important to recall that at the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton, according to Madison's notes, I went back and I looked at Madison's notes again. On those proceedings, the Constitutional Convention clearly demonstrated Hamilton's affinity for a powerful central government. Consider that he proposed, quote, letting one branch of the legislature hold their places for life, or at least during good behavior. Let the executive also be for life, he argued. He appealed to the feelings of the members present, whether a term of 7 years would induce the sacrifices of private affairs, which an acceptance of public trust would require, so as to ensure the service of the best citizens. These are Madison's notes. On this plan, we should have in the Senate a permanent will, a weighty interest, which would answer essential purposes. In other words, the senator should be permanent. Maybe the House 7 years or so. Hamilton's idea was quickly dropped as it had almost no support. Did anybody know this about Hamilton? No. Professor Raoul Berg, late great professor from Yale, In his book Federalism, the Founder's Design did more than most to delve deeply into the matter of implied, this is important, of implied and conversely expressed powers, which is crucial to determining how much liberty actually exists within democracies. You look at our Constitution, there's a text that's explicit, but then you have people seeking to create implications from the texts, implied powers. The exercise of implied powers is too frequently an abusive exercise and unauthorized power. Berger wrote, central to the constitutional scheme was restriction of the federal government to few defined and limited powers, and assurances that the state's residuary powers would be inviolable. That's where the action would be. He explains that in Federalist number 33, it was Hamilton who sought to ease any concerns the states may have had that the Constitution was establishing a federal government that could reach outside its expressed powers, the text of the Constitution. Hamilton himself, he wrote, quote, "What is power but the ability or faculty of doing a thing? What is the ability to do a thing but the power of employing the means necessary to its execution? What are the proper means of executing such power but necessary and proper laws?" Madison stated, writes Berger, that the clause, the necessary and proper clauses in the Constitution, gives no supplementary power. It only enables them to execute the delegated powers. So here we are. Implied powers, necessary and proper clause. If you're an activist, you want to grow the government and empower more and more centralized government, you want to push implied powers. Well, it's implied. There's a power. It's implied that we can pass all these laws in order to support that power. No, it's not. What is limited is you can pass laws, not broadly to support that power, but to enforce specifically the authority that's given to you.
For all this and much more, sign up for Levin TV.